On March the 1st, 1980, Officer Bob Warner is pouring himself a hot coffee to survive another night shift at the Ukiah police station in Northern California. And he doesn't like it at all because Bob Warner is not a desk guy. He's the kind of cop who lives for action, for calls on the radio, for movement. And right now, he's stuck behind a counter while the entire region is on edge. Because for several days, every police unit in the area has been searching for a missing 5-year-old boy named Timothy White. And Warner knows this case matters because the longer a child is missing, the worse the odds become. And he's been passing the time rereading reports, trying to stay alert, when he suddenly looks up and feels a jolt of confusion. Because through the glass door of the station, he thinks he sees a small blonde head, just barely visible, like someone hesitating outside. And for a moment, he assumes it's his imagination, fatigue playing tricks on him. But then the figure moves, and Warner sees clearly that it's a child, standing alone, peering inside. And as he watches, the boy reaches for the handle, freezes, then suddenly panics and runs away from the building. And Warner reacts instantly, grabbing his radio, calling for backup, and sprinting outside. And on the sidewalk, he sees the child again, now crying uncontrollably, clinging to an older boy, a teenager who looks exhausted, tense, and terrified all at once, standing completely still as if he's afraid that any movement will make everything fall apart. And in that moment, Warner has no idea that he's looking at the resolution of 2 missing person cases at the same time. Because the small boy is Timothy White, missing for days, and the teenager is Stephen Stainer, a child who vanished 7 years earlier and whom most people quietly assumed was dead. And before we can understand how these 2 boys ended up here in the middle of the night, we have to rewind the story years earlier, back to December 4th, 1972, in Merced, California, a quiet agricultural town where families feel safe enough to let their kids walk home from school and where danger feels like something that belongs somewhere else. And the Stainer family fits perfectly into that picture. A large household with parents who are active in the community, multiple children filling the house with noise, routines built around school schedules, chores, and shared meals. And Stephen Stainer, 7 years old at the time, is the 3rd child in the family, known as a sweet kid, affectionate, trusting, deeply attached to his parents, especially his father, and used to being surrounded by siblings. And the only time Stephen is ever really on his own is when he walks to and from school, usually under the watchful eye of his older brother. And that supervision reassures everyone, except on one particular day, when Stephen finishes school earlier than his siblings, something that excites him because for once, he gets to walk home alone like a big kid, and that small change in routine is all it takes. Because on the way home, Stephen is approached by a man in his 30s, handing out religious flyers to children in the neighborhood. A man who looks harmless, friendly, and out of place in a way that doesn't feel threatening. And the man asks Stephen a simple question: whether his mother would be willing to make a donation to the church. And Stephen answers honestly, saying she probably would, because she's religious and generous. And the man smiles, satisfied, and turns to signal another man sitting in a car parked nearby. And Stephen is invited to get in so they can go talk to his mother directly, and to a 7-year-old boy raised in a safe town. Nothing about this feels dangerous. It feels like helping an adult, like doing something responsible. And Stephen climbs into the back seat, gives directions to his house, and chats casually while the car drives, until something feels wrong, because instead of slowing down near his street, the car keeps going, and Stephen speaks up, saying they've missed his house. And the driver, a calm, confident man named Kenneth Parnell, doesn't react with panic or aggression. He reacts with reassurance, pulling into a gas station, stepping out to make a fake phone call, then returning with a smile and telling Stephen that everything is fine, that his mother agreed he could come along and even stay the night. And from an adult perspective, this is an obvious lie. But Stephen is 7, and the lie is crafted specifically to override his fear. And sitting beside Parnell is Edward Murphy, a co-worker who believes he's helping rescue a child from an abusive household because Parnell has been feeding him stories for days about violent families and neglected children. And Murphy doesn't realize until it's far too late that he's been manipulated into assisting a kidnapping. And when he finally understands something is wrong, Parnell turns on him, threatening him with prison, telling him he's already implicated, and Murphy freezes, terrified, choosing silence over action. And that single decision changes Stephen's life forever. While back in Merced, Stephen's parents realize something is wrong when he doesn't come home. Panic spreads quickly. Neighbors begin searching the streets, fields, and nearby areas. Police are called, volunteers organize, and the town mobilizes around the belief that a missing child must still be close, must still be found. But as hours turn into days with no sign of Stephen, the fear deepens. Investigators pursue every lead they can, questioning family members, searching wooded areas, checking landfills, and eventually expanding the search to include employees working in remote locations like Yosemite National Park, because everyone knows it's the kind of place where people can disappear. And yet, despite the effort, critical mistakes are made. Incomplete lists are provided, names are missed, and while the investigation stalls and desperation grows, Kenneth Parnell is already settling into the next phase of his plan, beginning the slow process of rewriting Stephen's reality. Kenneth Parnell drives Stephen deeper into California, away from Merced, away from familiarity, and toward Yosemite National Park, a place so vast and isolated that it almost feels designed for people who want to disappear. And once they arrive at the Yosemite Lodge where Parnell works, the atmosphere changes immediately because the friendly tone drops and Stephen realizes he's no longer a guest. He's a possession, and Edward Murphy finally understands the truth of what he's helped do. But instead of acting, he freezes because Parnell makes it very clear that if Murphy says anything, he'll be dragged down with him, telling him they're both criminals now and that prison will destroy his life. And Murphy, already damaged from his own abusive childhood, believes him, choosing silence out of fear, while Stephen is locked inside a room and introduced to the first rule of his new life, that nothing he remembers matters anymore. And over the following days, Parnell begins a process that is far more dangerous than physical restraint, because he starts dismantling Stephen's sense of reality piece by piece, telling him his parents didn't want him, that they had too many kids, that they gave him away, that a judge signed papers granting Parnell custody, and that there's nothing Stephen can do about it. And to reinforce the lie, Parnell gives him a new name, Dennis, insisting he repeat it, write it, respond to it, until the old name starts to feel distant, almost unreal. And this is where the kidnapping turns into psychological imprisonment, because Stephen isn't just being hidden, he's being rewritten. And while his parents in Merced are spiraling into despair, knocking on doors, organizing searches, pleading with police, and refusing to give up even as days turn into weeks, Parnell is careful not to hide in obvious ways, taking Stephen out in public, letting him ride in the front seat, walking him through stores, acting like a normal parent, because the more normal it looks, the less suspicious anyone becomes. And the investigation back home is drowning in noise, tips pouring in from all directions, psychics offering false hope, media pressure mounting, and critical opportunities slipping through cracks, including a devastating failure when authorities request employee lists from Yosemite facilities and receive incomplete information, unknowingly excluding Parnell's work unit, which removes him entirely from suspicion. And as the months pass with no answers, the town of Merced slowly shifts from hope to grief, while Stephen's life continues under false pretenses, moving from place to place as Parnell changes jobs, never staying long enough for questions to form, enrolling Stephen in schools under his fake identity, where administrators accept paperwork without verifying birth records, unknowingly giving Stephen a legal existence that erases the missing child everyone is searching for. And Stephen grows older inside this lie, attending, classes, making friends, forming attachments, while enduring abuse at home that he doesn't have the language or power to describe. And Edward Murphy remains present on the edges of this life, sometimes kind, sometimes distant, haunted by what he's allowed to happen, but still too afraid to speak. And over time, Stephen's resistance fades into survival because children adapt to whatever environment they're trapped in. And Parnell reinforces his control by alternating cruelty with gifts, buying Stephen toys, comics, fast food, later a dog named Queenie, creating moments of comfort that blur the line between captor and caregiver, confusing Stephen's emotions until fear, gratitude, and dependence exist at the same time. And while this is happening, Stephen's family never stops searching, writing letters to schools, contacting organizations, following rumors, clinging to the belief that their son is still alive somewhere, even as years pass and hope becomes painful to hold. And this contrast between relentless searching and absolute concealment is what allows the situation to continue, because one side is desperate and visible, and the other is quiet, controlled, and deliberately ordinary. As Stephen grows older, the shape of his captivity changes, because Kenneth Parnell understands that physical force is no longer enough to control a teenager. So he adapts, loosening some restrictions while tightening others, allowing Stephen more freedom outside the house, while reinforcing the psychological boundaries that keep him trapped. And by the time Stephen reaches his early teens, he is attending school regularly under the name Dennis Parnell, forming friendships, playing sports, even dating. And from the outside, his life looks normal enough that no one would ever imagine he is a missing child, which is exactly what makes the situation so effective, because the people around him see no reason to question his story. And Stephen himself is deeply conflicted, because while he knows something about his life is fundamentally wrong, years of manipulation have taught him that revealing the truth would lead to abandonment, punishment, or worse. And Kenneth reinforces this constantly, reminding Stephen that if anyone finds out, he will lose everything again. And at the same time, Kenneth presents himself as a permissive, almost indulgent father figure, buying Stephen expensive gifts, giving him alcohol, letting him break rules, telling him he can do whatever he wants as long as he stays loyal. And this creates a dangerous sense of dependency, because Stephen begins to associate obedience with comfort and rebellion with loss. And even when opportunities to escape appear, they dissolve under fear and confusion. Like the time Stephen briefly runs away late at night, but panics once he's outside, overwhelmed by the vastness of the world and the absence of any clear place to go. And he returns before anyone notices, reinforcing Kenneth's control even further. And back in Merced, the years grind on with no answers. Stephen's parents continue to live in a state of suspended grief, keeping his room intact, refusing to accept that he is gone, while the rest of the family quietly fractures under the strain, especially his older brother Carrie, who grows up feeling invisible next to a missing child, who dominates every conversation and every emotion in the household. And this unspoken tension lingers as Stephen moves through adolescence, unaware of how deeply his disappearance has reshaped the lives he left behind. And then, in 1980, after nearly 7 years of captivity, Kenneth makes a decision that will ultimately destroy him, because he tells Stephen he wants another child, framing it as a chance to be a family again. And Stephen immediately understands what that means, recognizing the exact pattern that began his own nightmare. And despite years of conditioning, something inside him refuses to accept it. But Kenneth doesn't listen, and instead recruits a teenage accomplice with promises of money and alcohol, sending him out to find a young boy. And on February 13, 1980, 5-year-old Timothy White is abducted while walking home from school, triggering a wave of panic eerily similar to the one Stephen's parents experienced years earlier. And when Timothy is brought to a remote one-room cabin in the mountains near Manchester, Kenneth begins repeating the same lies, telling Timothy that his parents abandoned him, that he belongs there now, and Stephen watches the scene unfold like a mirror of his own childhood, hearing the same words spoken with the same certainty. And this time, the illusion shatters completely, because Stephen can no longer pretend this is something he can endure quietly. And as Kenneth leaves for work one evening, trusting Stephen to look after Timothy, Stephen makes a decision that terrifies him more than anything else he's ever faced. Because for the first time, his fear of what Kenneth might do is outweighed by his fear of what will happen if he does nothing, and he quietly prepares to leave, hiding a knife for protection, lifting Timothy onto his back, calling Queenie the dog to follow, and stepping into the dark mountain night with no real plan beyond one simple goal: get Timothy somewhere safe, even if it costs him everything. Stephen walks for what feels like hours through the cold mountain darkness, every sound amplified by fear. Timothy clinging to him, confused and exhausted, Queenie padding along beside them, and with every step Stephen expects headlights, shouting, Kenneth's voice cutting through the night. But none of that happens, and when they finally reach a road, Stephen knows they can't just keep walking, because Timothy is too small and the distance is impossible. So he makes a decision that terrifies him almost as much as staying would have. He starts hitchhiking, standing at the edge of the road with a child in his arms and a dog at his feet, hoping someone will stop, knowing that trusting another stranger is the only option left. And after what feels like an eternity, a car finally slows down, driven by a man who speaks very little English, and Stephen keeps his explanation vague, saying they need to get to Ukiah, saying as little as possible because he's terrified that if he talks too much, the plan will fall apart. And by some stroke of luck, the man agrees and drives them into town, dropping them off near the center. And Stephen realizes this is it, the point of no return, because once Timothy sees police, everything changes, and as they walk toward the station, Timothy suddenly freezes, overwhelmed, terrified of going inside, terrified of uniforms, terrified of doing the wrong thing, and he runs back into Stephen's arms, sobbing, not understanding why this place is supposed to mean safety. And it's at that exact moment that Officer Bob Warner looks up from his desk and sees the two figures through the glass, the image that began this story. And when Warner rushes outside, Stephen forces himself to stay calm long enough to explain that the small boy is Timothy White, the child everyone is searching for, and Warner's reaction shifts instantly. Backup is called. Timothy is taken inside, and only then does Warner turn back to the older boy, asking who he is, and Stephen hesitates, because for 7 years his name has been taken from him, buried under lies. And he finally says the words that shatter the case wide open, that he's pretty sure his name is Stephen and that he thinks his last name is Stainer. And Warner immediately recognizes it, realizing he's standing in front of a boy who vanished in 1972, a case many believed would never be solved. And within hours, police locate Kenneth Parnell at his workplace and arrest him without resistance, searching the cabin, confirming everything Stephen said. And for the outside world, this feels like a miracle. 2 missing children rescued in the middle of the night. A nightmare ending with a single brave decision. But for Stephen, the story is far from over, because returning home is not the same as going back in time. And when he reunites with his family, the relief is real, but so is the distance. Because Stephen is no longer the child who disappeared. He's a teenager shaped by years of manipulation, abuse, and survival. And while the media descends on the family, turning the case into national news, interviews, headlines, and eventually a television miniseries, Stephen struggles quietly with addiction, confusion, and the pressure of being seen as a symbol rather than a person. And Kenneth Parnell's sentencing shocks many, because despite the years of harm he caused, he receives a sentence that feels painfully light, a reflection of laws that had not yet caught up to crimes like his. And Edward Murphy is also sentenced, though Stephen himself feels conflicted, seeing him as both accomplice and manipulated victim. And as years pass, Stephen tries to turn his survival into something meaningful, speaking publicly, warning families, advocating for stronger protections, building a life, finding love, becoming a father. And for a moment, it seems like the story might finally settle into something resembling peace, until tragedy strikes again in 1989 when Stephen dies in a motorcycle accident at just 24 years old, a loss that devastates those who saw him as a symbol of resilience. And years later, the story takes an even darker turn when Stephen's older brother Carrie is arrested for the murder of 4 women near Yosemite, revealing how deeply trauma can echo through a family across decades. And as the public struggles to reconcile these two legacies, Kenneth Parnell resurfaces one final time, attempting to arrange access to another child before being stopped and sentenced under harsher laws, dying in prison, while Timothy White grows up carrying his own scars, trying to live a normal life after being saved. And when people look back on this case now, what remains isn't just the horror of what was done, but the weight of everything that followed. Because this story isn't about a single crime or a single rescue. It's about how easily trust can be exploited, how systems fail quietly, and how survival doesn't end the moment someone walks through the doors of a police station.